You don't believe in God, not because you're angry, not because you're rebellious, but because deep down, you've never felt anything that made him real. And if you're honest, you're tired of pretending otherwise. You've heard the sermons. You've seen the verses posted on Instagram. You've sat through the moments where people cried during worship or raised their hands with trembling lips. But for you, it's never hit. It never pierced. It never touched. You've walked through all the motions, maybe even out of respect, maybe out of routine, maybe because you wanted it to be true. But there's always been this silent gap, this strange space between what people say about God and what you've actually experienced. And in that space, you learned to survive, quietly, rationally. You learned to nod and say, "I'm praying for you," even when you didn't believe anyone was really listening. You learned to appreciate the idea of faith, but never quite carry it yourself, not because you rejected it, but because it never showed up when you needed it most. Willian James called this condition the soul asleep, not a soul that denies, not a soul that hates, just a soul untouched. And he believed radically that it's not argument that wakes a soul like this. It's experience, it's encounter, something that bypasses intellect and shakes the center of who you are. Something that can't be explained away because it didn't come through logic to begin with. That's the tension so many people live in today. They don't call themselves atheists. They don't wear the badge of skepticism with pride. They just don't feel it. They want to, but nothing lands. Prayer feels like talking to the wall. Scripture feels like poetry from another world. And every time someone says God loves you, something inside shrinks because it feels like a beautiful story that was written for everyone else. So you keep going, quietly, carefully. You focus on what you can control, your job, your health, your relationships, your thoughts. And when life gets hard, you don't fold your hands in prayer, you clench them. You survive through logic, through order, through control. Because at least that gives you something to stand on, something predictable. But here's the part no one tells you. God doesn't speak the loudest when you're looking for him. He speaks when you stop pretending you're not lost. That's the beginning. Not some miracle moment, not some revival service, but the slow, haunting awareness that everything you've built to keep your life intact doesn't satisfy the ache you've kept buried underneath it. That ache? That's not doubt. That's not rebellion. That's your soul trying to wake up. And it doesn't need a preacher. It doesn't need a philosophy. It needs presence. The kind of presence that doesn't shout at you to believe. The kind that waits. The kind that doesn't argue, but moves through your pain in a way you can't explain. There are stories like this all over the world. People who didn't believe, didn't pray, didn't even think about God. Until one day, something cracked. A moment of beauty, a moment of despair, a moment that felt like coincidence until it didn't. And suddenly, everything changed. A man walks into the hospital room of his dying father, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. He doesn't know why he came, but when he enters, he feels something in the room, heavy, gentle, real. And for the first time in his life, he kneels. Not to be seen, not out of guilt, but because something else is there and he can't ignore it anymore. A woman sits on her kitchen floor at 2:30 a.m., eyes swollen from crying, holding a divorce paper in one hand and a bottle in the other. She whispers, "If you're real, say something." And for the first time, the silence doesn't feel empty, it feels occupied. That's not the result of theology, that's encounter. And once it happens, you can't go back. You don't become a fanatic. You don't suddenly quote scripture. But you know, you've touched something, or rather something touched you, and no one can talk you out of it, because no one talked you into it. James believed this kind of experience was the foundation of all real religion, not doctrines, not traditions, but something personal, experiential, transformative, something you can't debate because it's not a conclusion. It's a collision. And the thing is, most people who end up believing didn't start with belief. They started with a moment that shattered everything they thought they knew. a moment where reality cracked open and something holy slipped through. So if you're here right now, watching this, listening to these words, and something inside you is trembling, even just a little, don't ignore it. That trembling is not weakness. It's invitation. It's the first breath of a soul waking up. And what comes after that breath might be the voice you swore you'd never hear. Not all collapses are visible. Sometimes your life looks completely intact from the outside. You wake up on time, answer messages, pay your bills, show up to work, smile when you're supposed to. You post pictures, reply to "How are you?" with "Doing okay," and keep everything moving. No one suspects a thing, because the collapse that's happening isn't on the outside. It's underneath, quiet, private, unseen. It starts small, a weariness that doesn't go away, a disconnection that lingers after a prayer, a voice in your mind that says, "What's the point of all this?" Not loud, not even aggressive, just persistent, soft enough to ignore, but steady enough to haunt. And little by little, the colors begin to fade. What used to bring joy now feels flat. What used to stir awe now feels hollow. It's not depression exactly. It's not a crisis you can point to. It's a quiet, internal unraveling. A sense that somewhere along the way, something real slipped through your fingers, and you don't know how to get it back. Willian James spoke of this in his study of religious experience. He described a state that precedes true spiritual awakening, a kind of interior disintegration, a divided self, a person whose outward life no longer matches their inner condition. And the longer that disconnect continues, the deeper the ache grows. This is the soul beginning to break under the weight of unspoken contradictions. You say you're fine, but you feel fractured. You say you believe, but you feel nothing. You say you're strong, but secretly you're exhausted from pretending. And what makes it worse is that no one sees it, because there's no external event to blame, no death, no disaster, just a slow erosion of meaning. A sense that you're walking through life with a mask that no longer fits, carrying a heart that doesn't believe the words coming out of your mouth anymore. You can feel it during small moments. You're standing in line at the store and suddenly wonder, what am I even doing here? You're in a conversation and feel like a stranger in your own life. You lie in bed at night with a quiet dread you can't name, and you don't know if it's fear, grief, or something worse, emptiness. And here's the most terrifying part. You've lived with it for so long that you've started to think it's normal. But what if it's not? What if that inner collapse, that quiet breaking, isn't the end of your faith, but the beginning of your real one? James believed that most people never awaken spiritually because they never allow themselves to feel the full weight of their disillusionment. They patch it up, they keep moving, they avoid the silence. But for those who stop, who actually sit with the ache, the confusion, the spiritual exhaustion, something sacred begins to form. He called this the preparatory stage of transformation. The place where everything you thought was solid begins to crack. Not to destroy you, but to make room for something deeper. It's the moment when certainty dies, so that truth can be born. Think of it like this. If your soul was a house, this is the moment the foundation starts to sink. The wallpaper peels. The lights flicker. Everything seems to be failing, but instead of rushing to repair it, something in you decides to sit in the dark, to ask what's really underneath the structure. And that's when you hear it. The soft knocking from the basement you've ignored for years. That knocking isn't chaos, it's invitation. An invitation to confront the version of you that's been surviving without ever feeling alive. An invitation to let the collapse complete its work. Not so that you disappear, but so that the real you can finally emerge. And often, it's in this very moment, when you're at your most inwardly broken, that the divine begins to approach. Not to fix you, not to rescue you, but to reveal itself. Because God rarely speaks loudest when everything is going well. He speaks in the ruins, in the unfinished sentences, in the tears you cry in bathrooms so no one can hear. He shows up when you've run out of reasons to keep pretending you're okay. That's when something shifts. You stop asking God to prove himself. You stop trying to make sense of theology. You stop negotiating with belief. Instead, you do something terrifying. You open yourself, not out of faith, but out of surrender, because the collapse has done its job. It's cleared the stage. And now, something real can step in. This is what comes just before the voice. Not a voice that speaks in thunder or fire. A voice that meets you in the dust and the stillness. A voice you didn't believe existed until you needed it more than your next breath. And when that voice comes, when the presence finally breaks into your silence, everything changes. But you won't see that until the collapse is complete, until you've let yourself feel the full weight of being alone. Because sometimes God doesn't interrupt your collapse. He waits for it to finish. So that when he finally speaks, you know it's not your own voice echoing back. You know it's not wishful thinking. You know, it's him. And that's what comes next. It doesn't always start with light. Sometimes it begins with something you can't name. Not a vision, not a voice, just a presence. Soft but undeniable. It slips into the space around you like warm breath on cold glass, like a memory you never meant to recall. It's not loud, it doesn't demand, it doesn't even feel external at first. It feels like a pressure building quietly from within, a tightening in your chest, a stillness that makes you put down your phone without knowing why. And then it happens. Maybe you're driving, or sitting at the edge of your bed. Maybe you're doing nothing at all, just breathing, staring, existing, when suddenly you feel it. A shift, something so subtle that if you weren't completely cracked open already, you would have missed it. But you don't miss it. Because you're not the same person who would have ignored it before. The collapse already did its work. The silence already softened you. And now there's enough space inside you for him to speak, not in words, but in something deeper than words. Willian James wrote extensively about these kinds of experiences. He called them mystical, not because they were irrational, but because they transcended rationality. They were too immediate, too felt, too real to be dismissed, and yet too difficult to fully explain. He pointed out that people who have these experiences often describe them the same way, regardless of their background. It wasn't what I expected, but I knew it was real. That's the moment everything begins to turn, not because you understand what's happening, but because you can't ignore it anymore. You're not creating it, you're not forcing it, it's coming to you from somewhere else. Someone else. A man once described it like this: he was folding laundry, just trying to keep busy because his wife had just left him, and he didn't want to break again. And while standing in the stillness of his apartment, he felt something settle on him. Not in him, on him, like he was being watched but not judged, held but not touched. And then, out of nowhere, tears. Deep, shaking, childlike tears that felt like they came from the version of himself that stopped praying 15 years earlier. No words, no booming voice, just presence. That's how God speaks to the soul that doesn't expect it. And when it happens, even once, it undoes you. Because suddenly, all the times you said, God doesn't speak to me or God isn't real, start to feel like things you said before you were paying attention. And now, you're paying attention. You notice the way silence holds you differently now. You notice how your breath slows when you're alone. You notice that you're not quite alone, even when you think you are. Something, or someone, has started showing up in the cracks, in the still places, in the tears you don't understand. This is not religion, this is not doctrine, this is not ritual, this is encounter. And once you've had even a glimpse of it, the rules change. Because you stop chasing after belief, like it's something to achieve. You stop trying to convince yourself. You don't need proof, you felt it. That doesn't mean your doubt disappears. It doesn't mean everything suddenly makes sense. But it means your doubt now has a new voice to wrestle with, not your own thoughts bouncing around in the echo chamber of your mind, but a presence that speaks without speaking, that sits in the shadows with you and says, "I'm here." And maybe that's all you needed. Not an answer, not a miracle, just presence. That's how it begins, for real this time. That's the moment when belief stops being something you try to hold on to and becomes something that starts to hold you. James argued that these experiences, however brief, carry the deepest impact because they reorganize you. They don't change your mind, they change your orientation. You don't even realize how different you are until you notice the small shifts. You don't talk to yourself the same way. You don't avoid silence like you used to. You don't fear being wrong about everything because something in you has already been made right. And here's the part that always follows. You begin to hunger, not for more answers, but for more of that. More of him, that presence, that stillness, that invisible voice that didn't say anything but somehow told you everything. You might try to recreate the moment, go back to the same place, try the same song, but it won't come on command. It never does. Because it's not about the environment, it's about your availability, about whether you're open. And now you're open, wide open. Your heart has been cracked, your mind has been quieted, and for the first time, your soul is listening, not for arguments, not for logic, but for the one who doesn't need to prove himself, because he's already spoken in the only language that truly matters, experience. And the next time he speaks, when the presence doesn't just visit but stays, you'll no longer be asking, "Is God real?" You'll be asking, "Why did I ever doubt?" Because now you know, and what you know, no one can take away. What comes next is the moment your life starts to change. Not because of what you believe, but because of who just walked in. You don't come back from a moment like that the same. Something shifts deep beneath the surface, not loudly, not all at once, but permanently. You don't fully understand it, and you're not even sure you want to try, because whatever it was, whatever he was, it felt more real than anything else you've ever experienced. Not an idea, not a belief system, a presence, one that didn't need to explain itself, one that knew everything about you and stayed anyway. But here's what no one tells you about that kind of encounter. It doesn't fix you, it wrecks you. It turns everything you thought you understood about God, about life, about yourself into rubble, not to destroy you, but to rebuild you into someone capable of carrying what you just received. Because after the moment, after the presence, comes the unraveling. Not in a bad way, in a holy way. Your old way of thinking begins to feel too small. The categories you once used to make sense of things start to collapse. You try to pray like before, but the words don't fit anymore. You try to read scripture the same way, but it's different now. It reads you. And you realize that this isn't just some emotional experience you can file away. It's a before and after moment. Willian James wrote that conversion, when it's real, does not simply add something new to the person. It rearranges everything. He said it involves a regeneration of the self, not in the moralistic sense, but in the existential one. What once felt central now feels peripheral. What once held your confidence now seems fragile, and what once seemed invisible is now the most undeniable thing in your life. This kind of post-encounter transformation isn't dramatic on the outside. People may not notice right away. But inside, it's as if your soul is being reordered. The center of gravity has shifted. The foundation you once stood on, whether it was intellect, skepticism, or spiritual apathy, has been replaced by something weightless but unshakable. And that's when the real work begins. Because now, you're not just a person with questions. You're a person with evidence, not physical proof, but internal certainty. You know something happened. You just don't know what to do with it yet. You begin to revisit old memories through a new lens. You realize how close he was back then, even when you couldn't see him. You start to trace back the whispers, the moments, the coincidences that weren't coincidences at all. Like someone has turned on a light in a room you didn't know you were living in your entire life. And that light doesn't always bring comfort. It reveals everything. The wounds you forgot, the lies you believed, the walls you built to survive. Because presence doesn't just comfort, it exposes. It peels back layers you didn't even know you were hiding behind, not to shame you, but to free you, and the freeing is painful. A woman once said that after her first real encounter with God, she cried for 3 days, not because she was sad, but because she didn't know how to carry the truth she now knew. It felt like my soul was shedding skin, she said, like everything I thought I needed wasn't necessary anymore. That's the power of authentic spiritual experience. It rewrites you. It doesn't give you a new religion, it gives you a new relationship. It doesn't make you feel superior, it makes you feel seen. It doesn't answer every question, but it makes the ones that used to torment you fall silent. And you're left with this strange, sacred tension. You're not who you were, but you don't quite know who you are becoming. This is where many people panic. They try to rush the process. They try to box the experience into familiar categories. Join a new church, start a Bible plan, volunteer more, act holier. But none of that touches the thing that actually changed, because it wasn't about doing. It was about being known, being interrupted, being awakened. And now you've awakened to a world where God is not just real, He's near. And that nearness changes everything. It changes how you see others, how you see yourself, how you speak, how you listen. You find yourself more patient with people because you understand now what grace feels like. You become more tender toward pain because you know what it's like to be held in it. You don't need to win arguments anymore. You just need to stay connected to the one who answered you without using a single word. And in this place, there's no going back. You might try. You might get scared. You might doubt again. But the seed has been planted, and that seed has a voice, a whisper, a memory, one that never lets you forget what was spoken, even in the silence. This is where the spiritual journey deepens, not upward, but inward. And the question becomes, what happens when the presence doesn't just visit you in moments, but begins to live inside you? What happens when He doesn't just speak once, but keeps speaking, not through thunder, but through every corner of your life? That's what we'll uncover next. Because the voice that found you once was never planning to leave. At some point, the voice that once startled you, the presence that once felt foreign, begins to feel familiar. Not because it loses its power, but because you've started to recognize it. You know its texture now. You know the way it settles into a moment, not with noise, but with gravity. You know how it shows up in places you never expected. In stillness, in tension, in heartbreak, in joy. It's not just something you feel now and then. It's someone who's moved in. This is when everything changes, because you're no longer waiting for God to show up. You're learning to walk with Him. The silence that used to scare you has become a sanctuary. The ache that once made you question everything now feels like a signal, a place where He might be speaking again. You begin to realize this isn't about religion. It's about reality, not about a belief system, but about presence. A presence that is so deeply embedded in your day-to-day that you start to forget what life felt like before you knew He was there. Willian James called this kind of faith experimental in the best sense. Not theoretical, not borrowed, not second-hand, but lived, felt, tested, proven, not by evidence but by experience. This is the kind of belief that doesn't require constant defense because it's not built on argument, it's built on encounter. You don't need to explain it anymore. You just carry it. You walk into rooms differently. You listen more than you speak. You pause before reacting. You cry without hiding it. You pray without needing words. Not because you're trying to be spiritual, but because something in you has shifted so deeply. It just is now. It's who you are, or rather, who you're finally becoming. And this is where a new kind of fire begins. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, but it burns through everything that isn't real. You start to look at your life, your relationships, your choices, your habits, and you begin to feel what doesn't belong. Not in a judgmental way, not with shame, but with clarity. The same voice that met you in the stillness now meets you in the ordinary. It whispers, "This doesn't fit who you are anymore." So you begin to let go, not because someone told you to, because the presence inside you is too precious to crowd out. You stop chasing approval. You stop fearing stillness. You stop clinging to identities that kept you safe but small, because now you've tasted something larger, something more alive, something holy. You may still struggle, you may still fall into old patterns, but every time you do, there's a difference. You feel it faster, you return quicker because the voice hasn't gone silent. It just waits, gently, patiently, for you to tune back in. That's the nature of real transformation. Not perfection, but proximity. You stop trying to reach up to God, because now you understand. He came down, he entered the mess, he entered you, and he isn't leaving. A man once described it like this: "After the first time God spoke to me, I thought I had to keep chasing that moment forever. But eventually I realized I wasn't chasing, I was being led. He wasn't a flash in the dark. He became the light under every step I took." And that's the invitation now. Not to return to the moment, but to move from it. To let the encounter become a journey. To let the whisper become a rhythm. To let the presence become the pulse of your entire life. You won't always feel it. You won't always understand it. But you'll never again be able to say, "God never spoke to me," because he did. And the proof isn't in the memory, it's in the change. The way your voice softens when you speak to others. The way your chest opens when you forgive. The way your silence carries peace instead of fear. These are not coincidences. They are residues of the voice. James would say you've become twice born, not because you've become someone else, but because your old way of being couldn't contain the truth you've now experienced. You were cracked open, and in that breaking, something eternal moved in. And now you live differently, not because you're religious, but because you're awake. And once you're awake, everything becomes a conversation. Every pain, a place to be met. Every joy, a gift to be received. Every silence, a space to listen again. You don't believe in God because you were convinced. You believe because he spoke, and now you carry the echo of that moment everywhere you go. The question isn't whether he still speaks. The question is, will you keep listening, even when it's quiet again?